As I approached Mom's room, a soft sound reached my ears. It wasn't the usual creak of the floorboards or the hum of the heater. It was rhythmic, almost melodic, like a song sung too softly for me to understand. The countryside had always been a serene escape, with its rolling green hills, the golden shimmer of wheat fields, and the occasional sound of distant cowbells. Our farmhouse stood at the heart of it all, an old, sprawling structure with ivy creeping up its walls and a porch that stretched wide enough to hold the weight of our quiet lives. This is where I grew up, where my father built a life for us before his career pulled him further away. I'm 13 now, and it feels like I'm learning more about the world and my family than I ever wanted to know. It was my mother's birthday today. Dad, as usual, was away, too busy with his political career to join us. It had been months since he last came home, and his absence was beginning to feel more like the norm than the exception. Still, I wanted this day to be special for her. We decorated the dining table with wildflowers I had picked earlier, and Mom cooked a lovely dinner, her laughter filling the air as she moved around the kitchen. Rusty, our large red-coated pit bull, followed her every move, his tail wagging eagerly as if sensing the special occasion. When Dad called during dinner, I could tell something was off. "Happy birthday, Maggie," his voice came through the speaker, warm but distant. "Thank you, David," Mom replied, her tone polite but hollow. I watched her carefully as they talked. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Her responses were short, her voice lacking the warmth I remembered from when Dad used to call. Rusty sat beside her, his head resting on her lap. She fed him bits of her dinner, ruffling his ears with a fondness that seemed deeper than usual. After the call ended, she turned to Rusty with a playful smile. "You're my special boy, aren't you?" she whispered, her fingers stroking his fur. I tried to push down the pang of discomfort that rose in my chest. The birthday dinner ended quietly. Mom seemed happier as the evening went on, laughing at Rusty's antics and sharing stories from when she was young. I excused myself early, retreating to my room with my thoughts. Lying in bed, I couldn't stop replaying the scene from dinner, Mom's distant tone with Dad, the way her face lit up when she spoke to Rusty. It didn't make sense, but it left me feeling unsettled. Sometime past midnight, I heard a faint sound from the hallway. My curiosity got the better of me, and I crept out of bed, my bare feet silent against the wooden floor. As I passed by Mom's room, I heard something strange. It was soft at first, a rhythmic sound that grew louder the closer I got. I pressed my ear to the door, my heart pounding as I tried to understand what I was hearing. "Rusty," I heard her murmur, her voice low and tender. I stepped back, my face flushing with confusion and unease. At 13, I didn't fully understand what was happening, but I knew it wasn't something I was meant to hear. The next morning, I couldn't look Mom in the eye. Every time I tried, I remembered the sounds from the night before, the way she whispered to Rusty like he was someone more. I began to notice things I hadn't before. The way she brushed his fur for longer than necessary, the soft smiles she reserved just for him, the way he followed her around like a shadow. One evening, while we were having dinner, I saw her slip a piece of roast chicken under the table for Rusty. It wasn't unusual for her to feed him scraps, but this time, she leaned down to whisper something in his ear, her face glowing with a softness I hadn't seen in months. "Mom?" I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "Yes, sweetheart," she replied, sitting up quickly, her hand pulling away from Rusty's fur. "Why do you let him sit so close to you all the time?" She laughed, a little too brightly. "He's part of the family, isn't he? He just likes to be near me." I nodded, but her answer didn't satisfy me. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than that. One cold winter night, I couldn't sleep again. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that makes every creak of the floorboards sound like a thunderclap. As I wandered the hallway, I heard the sounds again, soft, rhythmic, and unmistakable. This time, I didn't hesitate. I pushed the door open just a crack, enough to see inside without being noticed. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat. Mom was sitting on the floor, her arms wrapped around Rusty's neck, her face buried in his fur. She was crying, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "Rusty," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know what I'd do without you." I closed the door quietly, my heart heavy with emotions I couldn't name. The image of my mother and Rusty stayed with me for days. Every time I looked at her, the scene replayed in my mind, her tearful embrace, the way she whispered his name like a secret. It wasn't something I fully understood, but it stirred a restlessness in me that I couldn't ignore. One afternoon, as I came home early from school, I noticed the house was unusually quiet. Mom wasn't in the kitchen, where she usually spent her time baking or preparing dinner. Rusty wasn't in his usual spot by the back door either. Curious, I walked through the house, calling out for her. When I reached the living room, I stopped in my tracks. Mom was sitting on the floor again, her hands buried in Rusty's thick red fur. She was speaking softly to him, her voice too low for me to make out the words. Rusty sat perfectly still, his head tilted slightly, as if he were listening intently. I stepped back before she noticed me, my mind buzzing with questions. What was she telling him? Why did it feel like I was intruding on something private? That evening, I stayed awake long after I was supposed to be in bed. I heard the familiar jingle of Rusty's collar and soft footsteps heading toward the front door. Quietly, I slipped out of my room and followed them. Outside, the moon cast a pale glow over the yard. Mom was walking Rusty down the dirt path that led to the woods behind our house. I stayed far enough behind to remain unnoticed, watching as they disappeared into the trees. I wanted to follow, but a strange fear held me back. What if I saw something I wasn't ready to see? What if the answers to my questions weren't ones I wanted to know? The next morning, Mom suggested we take Rusty to the pasture, which was a beautiful field just down the road from our house. It was something we hadn't done in months, and although I agreed, I couldn't shake the tension between us. At the pasture, Mom let Rusty off his leash, laughing as he bounded across the grass. He seemed lighter, freer, in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. I watched as he knelt down to call him, arms outstretched. He ran to Mom, tackling her to the ground in a playful hug. For a moment, I envied their connection. It was as if they existed in their own world, one that didn't include me or anyone else. Watching them, I felt like an outsider in my own family. That evening, while Mom was in the shower, I went into her room. I told myself I was just looking for answers, something to explain the growing distance between us. On her nightstand, I found a small leather-bound diary. Flipping through the pages, I saw entries about her days, notes about me, and long passages about Rusty. She described him in ways that startled me, using words like steadfast, intuitive, and comforting. There were entire pages devoted to him, recounting moments I didn't even remember happening. One entry caught my eye. Sometimes I think Rusty understands me better than anyone else ever could. He's my anchor, my safe place. I don't know how I would have survived this year without him. I closed the diary, my hands shaking. What did it all mean? Was it just the musings of a lonely woman, or was there something more? It was a quiet Saturday, the kind where the warm sunlight streaming through the curtains and the faint hum of cicadas outside lulled you into an afternoon nap. I had drifted off after lunch, dreaming of nothing in particular. When I woke, the house was strangely silent, the kind of stillness that wraps around you and whispers that something is out of place. Stretching and yawning, I got out of bed and called out, "Mom." There was no response. I checked the kitchen first, thinking she might be preparing dinner early, but the counters were empty. The living room was the same, with no sign of her. Rusty wasn't in his usual spot by the back door either. "Mom? Rusty?" I called again, my voice echoing slightly in the stillness. A faint unease settled in my chest, though I couldn't explain why. I slipped on my shoes and stepped outside, scanning the yard. The golden light of late afternoon painted everything in soft hues, but it felt off, like something was missing. As I wandered toward the barn, I called out again, my voice bouncing off the quiet expanse of the property. I was halfway to the barn when Rusty appeared, trotting toward me from behind the large doors. His tongue lolled out, and he looked content. Too content. It struck me as odd how calm he seemed, as though he had just had the best time of his life. "Where's Mom, huh?" I murmured, kneeling to scratch his head. Rusty wagged his tail, glancing back toward the barn. Something in his gaze felt almost knowing, like he was urging me to follow. Pushing the thought aside, I stood and walked toward the barn doors, my curiosity outweighing my growing apprehension. As I approached, I saw her, Mom, stepping out from the shadows inside. She froze when she saw me, her hand gripping the edge of the door as if she needed the support. Her hair was tousled, strands sticking to her flushed face, which glistened with a light sheen of sweat. Her clothes were wrinkled and slightly askew, and there was a redness to her cheeks that didn't look like it came from the sun. "Oh, daughter," she said, her voice choked. "You startled me." I stopped a few feet away, my eyes flicking between her and Rusty, who had padded up to stand protectively beside her. Mom was quick to smooth down her hair and adjust her clothes, but her movements were hurried, almost frantic, like she was trying to cover something up. "Are you okay?" I asked, tilting my head as I studied her. "What were you doing in there?" She laughed, but it sounded forced, a hollow attempt to fill the silence. "Just cleaning up a bit. You know how dusty the barn gets." I glanced over her shoulder into the dim interior of the barn. It didn't look any different from usual, hay scattered on the floor, tools hanging neatly on the walls, the faint smell of animals lingering in the air. Nothing seemed out of place, yet something didn't feel right. "You're sweating a lot," I said, unable to keep the curiosity and maybe a hint of accusation out of my voice. "It's warm in there," she replied quickly, brushing past me toward the house. "Let's go back inside. I'll make us some lemonade." As I followed her back to the house, I couldn't stop replaying the scene in my head. Something about it didn't sit well with me. The way she looked, the way she acted, and the way Rusty seemed so unusually satisfied. Questions swirled in my mind, each one darker and more confusing than the last. What had they been doing in the barn? Why had she been so flustered? Was it really just cleaning, or was there something more? I wanted to shake the thoughts away, to tell myself I was being ridiculous, but the doubt had already taken root. It wasn't just the barn. It was everything, the way she treated Rusty, the way she seemed to light up around him in a way she didn't with anyone else, not even Dad. That evening, as we sat at the dinner table, I couldn't stop watching her. She was cheerful, laughing at something I said and offering Rusty bits of food from her plate. To anyone else, it would have looked perfectly normal. But to me, every gesture felt loaded with meaning, like I was seeing something I wasn't supposed to. Rusty sat beside her chair, his head resting on her knee as she stroked his fur absently. He looked up at her with those big, trusting eyes, and she smiled down at him with a softness that made my chest tighten. I wanted to ask her about the barn, about what I had seen, or thought I had seen, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I sat there in silence, the questions building like a weight in my chest. The day started like any other, but as the afternoon rolled on, I began to notice something unusual. Mom was bustling around the kitchen, humming softly to herself, her energy more lively than I'd seen in a long time. Pots clanged, the oven door opened and shut, and the aroma of roasted meat and freshly baked bread filled the house. Curiosity got the better of me. Peeking into the dining room, I saw her carefully setting the table, a feast fit for a holiday. There were plates piled with roasted vegetables, a perfectly glazed ham, and even a cake sitting proudly in the center of the table. "Mom, what's all this for?" I asked, stepping into the room. She turned, startled, but quickly smiled. "Oh, Lily, it's Rusty's birthday. I thought it would be nice to celebrate." I blinked, unsure how to respond. Rusty's birthday? I glanced at the table again, feeling a twinge of something sharp and bitter in my chest. She had gone to such lengths for him. It wasn't that I didn't love Rusty, of course I did. But the effort she had put into this celebration was more than I could ever remember her doing for me. The thought made me pause. My last birthday had been simple, a small cake, a card, and a quick hug from Mom before she went back to her chores. This was a celebration. My chest tightened, a mix of envy and confusion stirring inside me. As we sat down to eat, Mom beamed at Rusty as if he were a guest of honor. She had even set a plate for him at the table. Rusty sat upright on a chair, his big brown eyes gleaming as Mom placed pieces of ham and vegetables in front of him. "Happy birthday, Rusty," she cooed, her voice filled with affection. Rusty wagged his tail, leaning into her touch as she stroked his head. I poked at my food, struggling to join in the cheerful atmosphere. Mom barely noticed my silence, too focused on Rusty. It was as if the entire evening revolved around him. My fork clattered against my plate as I pushed it aside, the knot in my stomach tightening with each moment that passed. After dinner, I excused myself and headed to my room. Lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, the sounds of laughter and the faint jingle of Rusty's collar still echoing in my mind. Sleep wouldn't come. The unease from earlier had only grown, twisting into something I couldn't name. Hours later, the house had gone quiet. I glanced at the clock on my nightstand, 11:42 p.m. The thought of Mom still downstairs with Rusty tugged at me. I got out of bed and tiptoed into the hallway, my bare feet silent against the wooden floor. As I approached Mom's room, a soft sound reached my ears. It wasn't the usual creak of the floorboards or the hum of the heater. It was rhythmic, almost melodic, like a song sung too softly for me to understand. My brow furrowed as I moved closer, my breath catching in my throat. A faint sound echoed through the darkness, faint at first but unmistakable. A steady sound that tore through the silence. My heart pounded, and I stood frozen, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. At 13, I couldn't quite make sense of the sounds, but there was something about them that made me shiver. They were low and vague, but there was an intensity to them that was hard to describe. I leaned closer to the door, my breath coming in short gasps from my throat. "Rusty," my mother whispered through the crack in the door. It wasn't the way she usually spoke. Her voice was much softer and more intimate. I stepped back, my heart pounding. 1,000 questions raced through my head, but I had no answers. I just knew that something was going on behind that door, something I shouldn't have heard. Returning to my room, I lay awake for hours, the image of Mom and Rusty replaying in my mind. A part of me wanted to dismiss it, to pretend it was nothing more than her finding comfort in our dog. But deep down, I knew there was something more, something I wasn't ready to understand. Years have passed since those days, and now I find myself walking a path not so different from my mother's. I'm a wife now, and my husband's job often takes him far from home. It's been 3 months since he last walked through our door, 3 months of quiet evenings, of dinners eaten alone, and of a house that feels far too big for just me and Kaka. Kaka, my loyal pit bull, lies at my feet as I sit by the fireplace, much like Rusty used to do for Mom. His deep brown eyes watch me with an understanding that needs no words. He's Rusty's son, and sometimes, when he looks at me in that particular way, it feels like Rusty is still here, watching over us both. Tonight, as the wind whispers through the trees outside, I think back to that winter so long ago. Back then, I didn't understand the depths of my mother's loneliness or the quiet desperation that comes from being surrounded by silence. But now, sitting here in the same stillness, I understand it all too well. There's a kind of longing that grows in the absence of a partner, a longing that fills the empty spaces with memories, with hopes, with a need for connection. I didn't see it then, but Mom found that connection in Rusty, her steadfast companion in a time when she needed it most. I glance over at Kaka, his sleek coat catching the firelight. He thumps his tail against the floor as if sensing my thoughts. A small smile tugs at my lips, and I reach down to scratch behind his ears. "Good boy, Kaka," I whisper, my voice soft. In that moment, I realize how much I've come to rely on him, just as Mom relied on Rusty. Life is strange that way, isn't it? The things we question in our youth often make the most sense when we're older. The fire crackles, sending shadows dancing across the walls, and I let out a long breath. The past is the past, but its lessons remain, shaping who we are and how we see the world. Mom's bond with Rusty may have been unusual, even hard to understand, but it was born out of a deep need for comfort, and that's something I can never judge. As Kaka nudges my hand, urging me to keep petting him, I smile again. Life is complicated, but in moments like this, it feels just a little bit simpler. Thank you for joining me on this journey of reflection and understanding. Have you ever found unexpected companionship in the quiet moments of your life? Share your stories in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more heartfelt tales. Until next time.